On the 28th of February, 2022, 48 hours after the initial satellite photograph was taken, the line of vehicles had expanded to an incredible length of 35 miles, 56 kilometers. There was a holdup of several weeks with the automobiles. They eventually withdrew and it appeared as though they vanished into thin air overnight. What came to pass? Why was that such a large contingent was unable to get to Kyiv? The action kicks off on the very first day of the conflict in the northernmost part of Ukraine close to the country's frontier with Belarus. A member of the 80th Air Assault Regiment in Ukraine named Vladislav, who was 23 years old at the time, noticed a flurry of brilliant lights in the night sky as he stepped outside for his first cigarette of the day. I will never forget witnessing the lights come on throughout the entire wood. At first, I mistook them for the headlights of a vehicle. After that, however, I came to the conclusion that they were Grads, which are self-propelled, multiple missile launchers. They were shooting in our direction. When the first Russian vehicles entered Ukraine, Vladislav's squad was on patrol deep within the woodland that makes up the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Their camp was there the entire. Why didn't we stop them? At Chernobyl, the ground itself was trembling from top to bottom. Have you ever been in a tank? There is no other sound that is comparable to it. It's a potent instrument in your hands. The plan called for Vladislav and the rest of the 80th Brigade to blow up the bridge that connected Chernobyl to Ivan, the next major town over from Chernobyl. In the event that an attack was launched, it would give Vladislav and his squad time to retreat to Kiev if the Russians were compelled to squander time constructing a replacement pontoon bridge. At first, I was taken aback. I couldn't understand why we didn't just halt them there. However, we needed to educate ourselves on our adversary, so that's the way we carried it out. Because they were so close to the border with Belarus, the Ukrainians did not have the financial means to risk starting another conflict by opening fire before putting their soldiers in harm's way. The first thing they needed to do was get a better understanding of Russia's strategy for the first vehicles that Vladislav saw were the beginnings of what would eventually become the convoy. The goal is to overthrow the Ukrainian government according to the Ukrainian armed forces. The 35-mile-long, 56-kilometer-long formation was in fact made up of 10 distinct Russian tactical battalion groups, despite what was reported by a number of media outlets at the Russian military also assaulted Ukraine in the east and the south, but the objective of these 10 troops was more specific. They were to invade Ukraine from Belarus, seize control of the capital city of Ukraine, and remove the government and military parlance. This type of assault is known as a decapitation. According to one Russian document that the BBC has seen, there is a schedule for the. On the morning of February 24th at 4 a.m. the 1st Battalion entered Ukraine. They were given instructions to immediately proceed to Kyiv and they were expected to arrive at 14:55. A number of the battalions were going to move forward to Hostel, which is located just north of Kyiv, in order to provide support for the soldiers that had been airlifted in to protect the air. The remaining individuals were going to proceed directly toward the city center of Kyiv. Both quickness and stealth played a significant role in the successful completion of the onslaught. Putin's secrecy has come at a price. According to the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, which is a security think tank located in the United Kingdom, Russian soldiers could overwhelm the Ukrainian forces in the north of Kyiv by a ratio of 12-1, provided that they keep their plans regarding an assault on the capital under secrecy. On the other hand, Putin's desire for concealment came at a because of how effective his deception was. The majority of his commanders did not receive their instructions until the final 24 hours before the incursion. This left them open to attack from a strategic point of view. They were lacking in provisions, gasoline, and charts. They lacked the instruments necessary for effective collaboration. They lacked significant quantities of them. They were so unprepared that they weren't even ready for the wintry conditions. The Russians, whose vehicles were poorly equipped with the incorrect tires and were surrounded by snow, drove right into a dirt puddle. Russian military reportedly told Ukrainian farmers to assist them in pulling their vehicles out of the muck, according to civilians located close to Ivan. Because they were unable to move forward, the Russian vehicles were forced to take cemented roadways in order to avoid driving on soft ground. This caused thousands of people to form a continuous line, as a result of the poor communication that existed between the battalions. However, they almost immediately became caught up in a massive battle. According to the advice of a military specialist who was stationed on the ground, you never ever journey into hostile territory in a lengthy convoy ever. In the period between the start of the conflict and the end of March, we were able to map the territory that the convoy traversed, thanks to the testimonies of witnesses and the intelligence obtained from the Ukrainian armed forces. Vehicles were able to escape driving through fields and wind up on the majority of the main roads that are located north of Kyiv. When the column reached its maximum length of 35 miles, 56 kilometers, it consisted of up to 1,000 tanks, 2,400 mechanized military vehicles, and 10,000 personnel in addition to hundreds of supply wagons bringing food, gasoline, oil, and m. The column's length had expanded to a maximum of 56 kilometers, 35 miles. The Russians had underestimated their opponent, which resulted in them becoming stalled north of Kyiv and running out of both food and gasoline. Valdemir, SCBA, and the other volunteers, the majority of whom were elderly, had been preparing for the arrival of the caravan in their community of Bichov for the previous 3. We set the vehicles on fire and slowed down the entire convoy. They dismantled all of the road signage, constructed checkpoints, and assembled a large number of gasoline explosives, all while being armed with a single machine gun. Between the 12 of them, the wait was finally over when early on Sunday morning, Russian vehicles drove into Volodar and his grassroots squad attacked the tanks with the limited resources that they had for close to a quarter of an hour. According to Volodar, we set fire to 2 of the vehicles and slowed down the entire column. We slowed down the entire caravan by using fire. However, after that followed the act of retribution. According to Maxim Apar, who was 30 years old, they started fire on us when they saw us flinging bottles. I was a bar. I didn't have any prior experience in the military. At the end of that half an hour, each member of Volodemy's group had been wounded and was taken to the hospital for treatment. But even while he was being treated in the hospital, Volodemy never stopped battling. He gathered sightings of the convoy from residents located all over the Kyiv metropolitan area, cross-checked them, and reported them to the appropriate Ukrainian author. On the other end of the call was Roman Porley, who is 23 years old and serves as the municipal deputy governor for Urban. My colleague and I were monitoring the hotline at the council office, receiving calls about the column, as well as calls from saboteurs who were individuals who were painting marks on the ground for the motorcade to follow, said the speaker. Everyone wanted to do what they could to protect their. Roman is a counselor during the day and a specialist in open-source intelligence when he goes home at night. He is known for his role as a co-founder of the well-respected website Deep State, where he compiles social media and intelligence reports. After that, he republishes them on his website after having them geolocated while traveling to Kyiv. The Russians were actively uploading recordings to various social media platforms. We redistributed the recordings in order to bring attention to their activities. They were merely putting on a performance, but as a result, the authorities caught them. According to Roman, the feeling that Ukraine was unified was of the utmost importance during the onslaught on Kyiv. Everyone was involved in some activity. I will freely confess that those first few days were filled with a lot of chaos. However, there was military personnel assisting residents. Everyone wished to do what they could to protect their community. There were hundreds of assaults against the convoy across the entire region, ranging from civilians equipped with homemade weaponry to mechanized soldiers and artillery. These attacks took place in cities and communities all over in sharp contrast to the Ukrainian forces, the Russian forces frequently displayed an inability to make dynamic decisions on the battlefield. This was in stark contrast to the actions taken by the Ukrainian forces. Russian vehicles formed circles according to Vladi SL from the 80th Brigade. All of the Russian soldiers were carrying massive metal crates labeled with the word. During the attack, we were able to capture one of them. We discovered their maps and each one was annotated with their complete itinerary. After that, we were aware of their entire game plan. In addition to that, their navigational instruments were horribly out of date. Following the conclusion of the invasion 1 year ago, the BBC has continued to discover maps that were abandoned by Russian forces and stretched back to the 1960s and 1970s. There are entire communities that did not exist when they were using those charts to navigate, but they do now. We also discovered semaphore signals, which are an extremely antiquated method of inter-unit communing. The Ukrainian resistance had some success with the strategy of blowing up bridges and dams in advance of the convoy, which caused the Russians to be forced to take a different path. The Russian units frequently became paralyzed by inside because they were forced to rely on outdated maps and had limited communications with their higher commanders. The Russian vehicles appear to be going in complete circles as seen in a number of satellite images. The Russian convoy was finally brought to a halt just outside of Kyiv city boundary as a result of pressure applied by Ukrainian airstrikes and artillery fire. The situation was absolutely terrible for the thousands of civilians who lived in close proximity to the stole troops. The Ukrainian army repulses Russian forces. They mad off with everything from every location. According to Vladislav, they cleaned out the stores. In addition to this, they used innocent bystanders as human shields. What occurred in many villages and cities to the north and west of Kyiv is still being investigated by numerous authorities, including the International Criminal Court. After a grueling period of 4 weeks, the Russians started to pull back their forces. The area adjacent to the airfield and hostel saw the destruction of 2 of the biggest remaining battalions. Artillery fire destroyed an additional 370 covered army vehicles that appeared to have been abandoned in this Vaka settlement. After being pushed back repeatedly by the Ukrainian military up until the 19th of March, the Russian forces eventually started pulling back from the Kyiv Oblast. Moscow is continuing to advance into the eastern industrial stronghold of Donbass and is also striking in the southern direction in the direction of the Khan and Zaporizhzhia regions. The majority of military analysts believe that a fresh assault on Kyiv is highly unlikely, despite widespread rumors. To the contrary, this is due to the fact that Russia has not yet sent a significant number of soldiers to the frontier with However, the Ukrainian trainees are still monitoring the situation via reconnaissance drones located close to the boundary that night. In Chernobyl is one that will stick with me forever, says Vladislav, when I ventured out for a cigarette with an acquaintance. On the other hand, by the time I had completed my cigarette, the conflict had already begun. My friend and I have this fantasy that we are going to go on shift just like we did on that day.